Dr. Rebecca Hayes couldn't believe what she was seeing through the thick glass of the observation deck. Her breath fogged up the window as she stared down at the planet below. A huge creature called a thornback was doing something that made no sense at all. The thornback was enormous, almost 12 feet tall, with sharp crystal spikes running down its back like a dangerous rainbow. These things were killers. They hunted in groups and could tear apart a spaceship without breaking a sweat. Everyone in the galaxy knew to stay far away from them. But this one wasn't acting like a monster at all. Instead, it was being gentle with a small fuzzy creature next to it. The little one was obviously its baby. The big thornback used its massive head to carefully push the cub toward the human research station. It moved so slowly and carefully, like a parent helping a scared child take their first steps. "Commander Williams, you have to see this right now," Rebecca called out, her voice shaking with excitement. James Williams walked over from his desk, coffee mug in hand. He was the military guy in charge of keeping everyone safe at the research station. His face was rough and weathered from years of service, and he'd seen plenty of weird things in space. But when he looked down at what Rebecca was pointing at, his eyes went wide, and his coffee mug nearly slipped from his fingers. "What in the world?" he whispered, pressing his face against the glass next to Rebecca. "That's the third time this week. These thornbacks are supposed to be the most dangerous things on this planet. They hunt in packs and can destroy our shuttles, like they're made of paper. Why is it being so nice?" They watched in amazement as the giant thornback did something even stranger. It lowered its massive head toward the ground, almost like it was bowing to them, like it was showing respect. Then it turned around and walked back into the dark forest, leaving its baby behind. The little thornback cub didn't cry or try to follow its parent. Instead, it sat down right by the entrance to their research station. It looked just like a loyal dog waiting for its owner to come home. Its tiny crystal spikes glittered in the sunlight, and it made soft chirping sounds that almost sounded like purring. Rebecca pulled out her tablet and started typing notes as fast as she could. Her fingers were shaking with excitement. "James, this isn't normal animal behavior. Every single predator species we've met does exactly this same thing. They bring their babies to us, then they leave. Not to the Craxi military bases, not to the peaceful Luminari temples, only to human settlements." Williams scratched his gray beard, something he did when he was thinking hard about a problem. "The folks back at command think it's just a weird coincidence. Maybe these creatures are just confused or something." "Command is completely wrong about this," Rebecca said, her voice getting stronger. "This is happening everywhere humans have settled, on every planet, with every dangerous predator species. They all do the same thing. They trust us with what matters most to them, their children." She pulled up data on her tablet, showing Williams reports from other human colonies, pictures and videos from dozens of different worlds. Giant spider-like creatures on one planet, flying serpents with poison stings on another, massive bear-like animals with fur made of living metal, all of them doing the same thing, bringing their babies to humans. "Look at this data, James. It's not random. It's not coincidence. There's a pattern here, and it's bigger than just one planet or one species. Something about humans makes these creatures trust us in a way they don't trust anyone else in the galaxy. We need to figure out why." William stared at the small thornback cub, which had now curled up by their door like it belonged there. "This could change everything we know about how predators think, about how they see us." Rebecca nodded, already planning her next research steps. She had a feeling this discovery was just the beginning of something much bigger and more important than anyone could imagine. 3 months had passed since that first amazing discovery, and Rebecca found herself standing in the most important room in the galaxy. The Galactic Research Council chamber was huge, with a domed ceiling that showed the stars spinning slowly. Overhead, her hands were shaking a little as she prepared to share what she had learned. This was her one chance to convince the most powerful beings in the universe that something incredible was happening. The chamber was filled with representatives from 12 different alien species, and each one looked completely different from the others. The hive-mind creatures looked like giant insects with multiple arms and glowing compound eyes. They moved in perfect unison, like they were all controlled by one brain. The Luminari were beautiful and ghostly, their bodies seeming to be made of pure light that shifted through different colors as they thought. The Craxi were the warrior race, covered in tough armor-like skin, with sharp claws and teeth that could tear through metal. Rebecca took a deep breath and activated the holographic display in the center of the room. Immediately, the air filled with three-dimensional images and data charts that floated around her like magic. "The evidence is impossible to argue with," she began, her voice echoing through the massive chamber. "On 47 different planets that we've studied, the most dangerous predators all do exactly the same thing. They only bring their babies to human settlements, never to anyone else." General Thox, the Craxi ambassador, made a clicking sound, with his mouth parts that everyone knew meant he was annoyed. His warrior species had been exploring space for thousands of years, longer than humans. "Dr. Hayes, your people have only been in space for a few hundred years. You're still babies compared to us. You're probably just misunderstanding normal animal behavior." Rebecca had expected this reaction. She knew that most alien species thought humans were too new and inexperienced to make important discoveries, but she had prepared for this moment. "If I'm wrong, then please explain this to me," she said, activating a new set of recordings that filled the air around them. The holographic images showed different planets and different creatures, but the same amazing behavior happening over and over. On Proxima 3, massive wolf-like creatures, called shadow wolves, were bringing their puppies to human colonies. These wolves were pitch black and could become invisible in darkness, making them perfect hunters. But there they were, gently carrying their babies in their mouths to leave them at human doorsteps. The next image showed the Centauri system, where creatures called void sharks lived in space itself. These monsters were bigger than whales and could survive in the vacuum between planets. They had rows of crystal teeth and could move faster than most spaceships, but the recordings showed them carefully pushing their young toward human space stations while avoiding everyone else. "And here on New Terra," Rebecca continued, showing images of bear-like animals with fur that looked like it was made of living crystal. "The crystal bears do the same thing. Every single time these creatures feel threatened, they bring their cubs to us. Not to Craxi military bases, even though you're the strongest fighters in the galaxy. Not to Luminari temples, even though you're known for being peaceful and wise. Not even to hive nurseries, even though you take better care of children than anyone else." Dr. Patrick Thompson, Rebecca's research partner back on Earth, suddenly appeared as a shimmering hologram next to her. He had been working on this project for months, analyzing genetic data from hundreds of different species. "The pattern is consistent across creatures whose evolutionary paths split apart millions of years ago," he explained to the council. "This behavior isn't something these animals learned from watching each other. It's built into their DNA. It's evolutionary programming that goes back to the beginning of life on their planets." The entire council chamber became completely quiet. The only sound was a soft humming noise coming from the Luminari representative. Everyone in the galaxy knew that when the Luminari hummed like that, it meant they were thinking very deeply about something important. Their light bodies shifted through different shades of blue and purple as they considered what they had just heard. Rebecca looked around at all the alien faces staring at her. Some looked skeptical, others looked curious, and a few looked almost frightened. She knew that what she was suggesting would change everything they thought they knew about humans and their place in the universe. The piercing wail of emergency sirens cut through the peaceful night on Colony 7 like a knife. Captain Lisa Morgan had been enjoying a quiet cup of coffee in the command center when the alarms started screaming. She nearly dropped her mug. As she rushed to the sensor displays, her heart sinking at what she saw on the screens. 20 massive warships had just appeared out of nowhere, materializing from hyperspace like deadly ghosts. These weren't just any ships. They belonged to the Ravagers, the most feared pirates in this part of the galaxy. The sensor readings showed that every single one of their weapons was already locked onto the colony. Red warning lights painted the entire command center in an ominous glow as the targeting systems calculated the incoming threat. Lisa grabbed her communication device and started barking orders as fast as she could. All civilians need to get to the evacuation shuttles right now. This is not a drill. We've got maybe 10 minutes before those ships are in firing range, and her words got stuck in her throat as she looked out through the large windows of the command center. What she saw made absolutely no sense at all. The shadow wolves that lived in the deep forests around the colony weren't running away like they should have been. These creatures were smart enough to know when danger was coming, and they always disappeared into the woods when there was trouble. But tonight was different. Tonight, the massive six-legged predators were doing something that made Lisa's mind reel with confusion and wonder. They had come out of the forest in huge numbers, and were arranging themselves in a perfect circle around the entire human colony. Each wolf was enormous, about the size of a small transport vehicle, with sleek black fur that seemed to absorb light itself. What made the sight even more incredible was what the wolves had done with their babies. Right in the center of their defensive formation, dozens of wolf cubs were sitting in neat, orderly rows. The little ones looked calm and peaceful, as if they knew they were in the safest place possible. Their amber eyes glowed softly in the darkness, and they made quiet chirping sounds to each other. "Captain Morgan, come in." Sergeant David Clark's voice crackled over the radio, and she could hear the amazement and fear mixed together in his tone. "The wolves. Captain, they've left all their young ones with us. They're not running away. They're protecting us." Lisa raised her binoculars to get a better look at what was happening around the colony's outer edges. Through the powerful lenses, she could see adult shadow wolves taking up defensive positions all along the perimeter. Each massive creature had positioned itself at a strategic point, creating an impenetrable wall of muscle, claws, and determination. Their glowing amber eyes were all focused outward, watching the enemy ships that were getting closer every second. These weren't just random positions either. The wolves had somehow coordinated themselves to create overlapping fields of protection. They had taken the high ground on small hills, hidden themselves behind rocks and trees, and spread out just far enough to cover every possible approach to the colony. It was like watching a military unit deploy for battle, except these were wild animals acting on pure instinct. Lisa felt something change inside her chest as she watched this incredible display. The wolves trusted humans enough to leave their most precious possessions, their children, right in the middle of the human settlement. They had made a choice to stand and fight alongside the colony, instead of fleeing to safety in the deep forest. She lifted the communication device to her lips again, but this time her voice was completely different. Instead of panic, there was determination. "Cancel the evacuation order," she whispered at first, then spoke louder and clearer. "All units, get to your defensive positions immediately. We are not running away from this fight." The soldiers in the command center looked at her with surprise. They had enough shuttles to evacuate most of the colonists, and running away seemed like the smart thing to do when facing 20 enemy warships. But Lisa understood something that went deeper than military tactics or survival odds. If these magnificent creatures trusted humans enough to risk their own lives and leave their babies in human care, then the humans had earned that trust. They had a responsibility to prove that the wolves' faith in them was justified. Lisa watched the enemy ships getting closer and felt a fierce pride burning in her chest. Tonight, they would stand together, human and wolf, fighting as one against the darkness. Bright flashes of plasma fire lit up the dark sky like deadly fireworks as the battle raged overhead. Inside the colony's archaeological research center, Dr. Rebecca Hayes was working faster than she ever had in her life. Her hands flew across the control panels of her deep scanning equipment, while explosions rumbled in the distance. The strange behavior of the Shadow Wolves had sparked a memory from her studies, something she had read about humanity's first journeys into space. "Patrick, are you seeing these readings?" she shouted into her emergency communication device as her scanners pushed deeper and deeper into the planet's surface. The machines were designed to look through solid rock and find hidden structures or artifacts buried far below ground. Dr. Patrick Thompson's voice came through the speaker, crackling with static from the battle happening above them. "Rebecca, these energy patterns, they're definitely not natural rock formations." His voice was shaking with a mixture of excitement and terror. "What you're looking at down there is artificial. Someone built those structures. And Rebecca, they're incredibly old, older than anything we've ever found before." The scanning equipment was showing her things that shouldn't exist, buried 3 miles beneath. The surface of the planet were massive buildings and tunnels that formed what looked like an entire underground city. The computer was calculating the age of these structures, and the numbers it displayed made Rebecca's hands tremble. These buildings were older than human civilization. They were older than any recorded history from any species in the galaxy. But what made her blood turn ice cold was what the biological scanners were detecting. Mixed in with the ancient stone and metal, her equipment was finding traces of DNA. Not just any DNA, but genetic material that looked disturbingly familiar. "This can't be right," Rebecca whispered to herself, checking the readings again and again. "Patrick, I'm detecting human DNA down there, but that's completely impossible. Humans only started traveling to other planets 300 years ago. These structures are millions of years old." Patrick's voice came back through the speaker, barely audible over the sounds of the battle raging above ground. "Rebecca, look more carefully at those genetic markers. They're not exactly human DNA. They're close, but they're different. These are pre-human genetic patterns. What you're looking at are the traces of our ancestors, the ones who somehow left Earth millions of years before modern humans ever developed space travel." Rebecca's scanning equipment had found a way to penetrate into the central chamber of the buried city. What she saw on her screens made her gasp out loud. The walls of this ancient room were covered with elaborate stone carvings that told a story in pictures. The images showed tall figures that looked almost human, but not quite. They were surrounded by creatures from all across the galaxy, some that looked exactly like the Shadow Wolves outside, others that resembled the Thornbacks from her original discovery, and dozens of other species she recognized from different planets. But these weren't images of hunting or fighting. Instead, the carvings showed these human-like figures protecting the creatures. In scene after scene, the tall figures were sheltering young animals, healing injured beasts, and standing guard over entire species. They were protectors, guardians, shepherds of all life in the galaxy. Rebecca activated her translation program and pointed it at the ancient writing that accompanied the stone pictures. The computer worked for several minutes, comparing the symbols to thousands of known languages from across the galaxy. Finally, words began appearing on her screen. "The shepherds," Rebecca read aloud, in a voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't just stories. They weren't myths or legends. The ancient text told an incredible story. Long before any of the current galactic civilizations existed, there had been a race of beings who traveled from world to world. They didn't conquer or colonize. Instead, they protected. They helped young species survive and grow. They defended the innocent from predators and disasters. They were the guardians of all life in the universe." According to the carvings, these shepherds had somehow disappeared from the galaxy millions of years ago. But before they left, they had done something incredible. They had planted the seeds of their own genetic code on a distant world. ensuring that someday their descendants would return to continue their work. That distant world was Earth, and their descendants were humanity. Rebecca stared at the screen, understanding flooding through her like cold water. The shadow wolves weren't acting on random instinct when they brought their cubs to humans. They were following genetic memories that had been passed down through millions of years of evolution. Deep in their DNA was the knowledge that humans were the children of the ancient protectors, the ones who could be trusted above all others to keep their young safe. The battle still raged overhead, but Rebecca felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. Humanity wasn't just another species exploring the stars. They were the inheritors of an ancient responsibility that stretched back to the dawn of galactic civilization. Admiral Helen Brooks had seen many battlefields in her long military career, but nothing could have prepared her for what greeted her when the rescue fleet arrived at Colony 7. She expected to find wreckage and devastation. She expected to be coordinating evacuation efforts for survivors. Instead, her jaw dropped as she stared out at something that defied everything she knew about warfare and nature. The colony was completely undamaged. Around its perimeter lay the twisted remains of 20 Ravager warships, their hulls torn apart and scattered across the landscape like broken toys. But what made Admiral Brooks forget to breathe wasn't the destroyed enemy fleet. It was the sight of hundreds upon hundreds of massive predators standing in perfect formation around the human settlement. These weren't just the shadow wolves that lived on this planet. Creatures from dozens of different worlds had somehow arrived. During the battle, there were crystal-scaled serpents that normally lived in the vacuum of space. There were massive bear-like creatures with metallic fur that could conduct electricity. There were flying predators with wings that sparkled like diamonds. All of them were standing together in peaceful cooperation, something that should have been impossible, since most of these species were natural enemies. Admiral Brooks' shuttle touched down on the colony's landing pad, and she was immediately met by Captain Lisa Morgan. The colony's military commander looked absolutely exhausted, with dirt and soot covering her uniform. But her eyes were bright with amazement, and something that looked almost like religious wonder. "Captain Morgan, report," Admiral Brooks said, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the incredible scene around them. "How many different species responded to help you?" Lisa shook her head slowly, as if she still couldn't believe what had happened. "Every single apex predator species, within 50 light-years of here, Admiral. We counted representatives from at least 30 different worlds. The moment the Ravagers started attacking, these creatures just began appearing out of nowhere. They came through the forests, dropped from the sky, even emerged from underground tunnels we didn't know existed." Before Admiral Brooks could respond, Dr. Rebecca Hayes came walking toward them from the direction of the archaeological dig site. Her clothes were filthy with dirt and dust, her hair was a mess, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. But her eyes were blazing with excitement and discovery. "Admiral Brooks, we need to have a very important conversation," Rebecca said, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had learned. "Not just us, but all of humanity. Everyone needs to know what I've discovered down there." They made their way to the settlement's main community hall, which had become an incredible sight. The large room was filled with sleeping baby predators from a dozen different species. Thorn-backed cubs were curled up next to shadow wolf pups. Crystal serpent hatchlings were wrapped around the legs of young metal bears. Natural enemies from across the galaxy were sleeping peacefully together, like one big, impossible family. Rebecca stood in the center of this amazing scene and began to explain discoveries that would change everything humanity thought they knew about themselves. "We've been thinking about this all wrong," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Humans aren't just another species that learned how to build spaceships and decided to explore the galaxy. We're something much more important than that." She gestured toward the windows, where the great predators continued their patient vigil around the colony. "These apex predators remember something that we completely forgot. Something that's been buried in their genetic memory for millions. of years. Our ancestors, the beings we now call the shepherds, once protected all life in the galaxy. Admiral Brooks found herself looking out at creatures that should have been tearing each other apart, but instead were standing together in perfect harmony. That's impossible, Dr. Hayes. Human civilization is only a few thousand years old. We've only been in space for 3 centuries. Human civilization, as we know it, is young, Rebecca agreed. But our genetic line is ancient beyond imagination. Every species that became an apex predator did so under the protection and guidance of our ancestors. They evolved not just to survive, but to recognize us, to trust us with what matters most to any parent, their children. Through the large windows of the hall, they could see the continuing miracle outside. A massive thornback was gently grooming a young shadow Volf. Flying serpents were sharing food with ground-dwelling creatures they would normally hunt. Species that had been enemies for millions of years were working together because of their shared trust in humanity. Admiral Brooks stared at this impossible scene and asked the question that would define humanity's future. Dr. Hayes, if all of this is true, then what happens now? What are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Rebecca smiled as she watched a playful thornback cub chase a giggling shadow Volf pup around the room. The 2 babies were playing together like puppies, completely unaware that their species should be mortal enemies. Now, we stop pretending we're just explorers and traders, she said softly. Now we remember who we were always meant to be. She looked up at Admiral Brooks with eyes that held the weight of galactic destiny. The galaxy has been waiting for millions of years for the shepherds to return. Today, we finally came home. Outside the windows, the great beasts continued their eternal watch, just as they had done for countless generations, patiently waiting for humanity to remember their true calling as protectors of all life in the universe.